Webcam microphone up close. Webcam microphone up close.
At the age of 19 in 1962, she was
See, but I have the files. I read this stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things. I said to myself, how can that be possible? The brain, pistols and fondle slab of choice. I don't know when that was. Doesn't really matter. Internet, professional wrestlers, and not just Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the information comes from as long as it's real. It doesn't. It's hard to get real information because seriously, they don't want you to have just read two sources. Whenever I try to prove out, it's not. If you expect your government to tell you the truth, you're going to be sadly disappointed. Another one of these things.
Dear Lord, what a dirty, dirty old man.
Really? You can't be serious. Is this really how you want things to be? Come on. More hooker, eruptions, eruptions, whatever.
Like Dave Powers kind of.
Really?
Allegedly broadcast live from Pima Region 2. Within the borders of the formerly united and currently occupied states of America, we bring you the Ochelli Effect.
I damn sure know I'm an original. We have all these situations. I'd love to know why it takes 50 years, for
that's that.
For a 19-year-old girl to eventually get up to gumption to.
Oh, and all that noise means we are live on UCY.TV radio. This is the Ochelli Effect, and of course I am Chuck Ochelli. Now, tonight, everybody seems to think that lately all I'm doing is focusing on the JFK case, but not true. Tonight I'm going to focus on something that should have come across your media memes about 24 hours ago, which would be the observance, once again, of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. Now, this case has been among some of the most contentious cases among scholars over the years. However, it doesn't get the same type of attention quite often in the mainstream media as the Kennedy assassination has. Meanwhile, over the years, I have learned a great deal about the case outside of what, say, the mainstream historians, the mainstream media, and everybody else has tried to sort of push down our throats. My personal opinion at this point is that a guy who was, again, a patsy of an assassination was presented and sort of thrown to the wolves legally again, and that was James Earl Ray. Part of that was based on the work of, say, people like Dr. William Pepper, which always causes some people to laugh if they have no familiarity, because Dr. Pepper, after all, is often, more associated with a soda than that guy. But he was the one who got the trial done in Memphis in, I believe it was 99. Which was a civil case where there was a wrongful death suit and the King family participated, and on and on and on. But over the years, there has been other work done on this case. And it has been recent, to me anyway, that I've learned about some of the work done by others who I have known in other ways through the JFK case. A gentleman who I've never actually had the pleasure to speak to before, but agreed to be on the air with me tonight, is Mr. Stuart Wexler, who we are all on the East Coast battling the pollen, so you can hear him cough a few times. That is Mr. Wexler, and he is the co-author of a book with Larry Hancock called The Awful Grace of God, and there's a subtitle to that book as well, but if you look it up just that way, you'll find it. And it gives us a completely different take on the King assassination than we have seen before, at least in my opinion. And tonight I'm going to learn along with you guys, okay? Some of this stuff I guarantee you I have never heard of before. Some of it is very familiar to me. But with all of that aside, enough of my voice and enough of my opinions, let's talk to Mr. Stuart Wexler. How are you tonight, Stuart?
I'm good, Chuck. How are you?
All right. And like I said, we're all kind of muddling through the pollen a little bit, so it's one of those things, but Here we go. So what is it that actually caused you to begin to look into the King case yourself?
So about by now it would be almost 10 years ago, Larry and I were actually looking into the Robert Kennedy assassination. And we ran into this somewhat crazy theory related to the girl in the polka dotted dress. And it connected to a couple of people who we had never heard of, who were terrorists for white supremacist groups, the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Mississippi. And more or less this person accused a female school teacher who was actually a night rider or a Klan terrorist by night named Kathy Ainsworth of Mississippi of being the girl in the polka dotted dress. And there, he said a bunch of crazy things about the Anti-Defamation League. But he did have some interesting picture comparisons involving this woman, the supposed description of the girl in the polka dotted dress, and the gentleman by the name of Tommy Tarrance, and some of the descriptions of even Sirhan. And so Larry and I actually first started looking into that, and we dismissed their connection to the Robert Kennedy assassination. But we kept on finding very interesting things to suggest their potential involvement in the King assassination. And when we explored that further at a number of different angles, I started going into 3 or 4 different directions in the research. And sort of the second big break was finding a witness who had never been interviewed by any of the follow-up investigations. He had been interviewed only even before the king was assassinated, and a few months later, a guy by the name of Donald Nissen. And I went through a lot of hoops and eventually found him and talked to him by phone. And with his help and a lot of side research, it also, as a completely independent angle, came back to the same group of people, the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Mississippi. And then, independently working back from the White Knights, came across what really amounted to a whole entire subculture of white supremacists that no one really knows about, and that had a very different agenda than the typical, and I hate to refer it this way, but I guess it's the best way to get the point across, the typical redneck racist or Klansman in the 1960s.
Can I ask you a question about that, actually? Because
yes, go right ahead.
The narrative has emerged in JFK research a few times over the decades about this Joseph Miltier character, right?
Yes.
And the idea that he was going around and trying to raise money, in some cases, has come up before in other people's work. I know that. Yes. About, maybe even putting a bounty on Martin Luther King Jr.'s head and stuff like this. And he had been tied into some of these types of groups. I mean, is this the kind of guy that we're talking about here?
He's exactly the kind of guy. In fact, we believe he may very well have been the guy who raised a bounty that went to Mississippi for the assassination.
Well, there were several individuals that were going around and doing this at that time, and there was a lot of, let's sort of put that in context. There was a lot of unrest considering the climate, say, in the South at the time, and a lot of these individuals who were sort of fighting back against say, everything from the bus strike to the garbage man strike to all this stuff that we know about now. But there were a lot of individuals who were doing a lot more than just showing up with sticks and bats. They were actually trying to organize. Am I right?
Yes. And what's fascinating about it is it's almost like there's 2 groups of people. There are the groups of people that I think everybody's familiar with, which is sort of the street violence, the hoses, the beatdown of the Freedom Riders in 1961. There's those folks, and that's the folks we refer to as sort of the redneck racists. What we found was that at the top of some of these other groups at the top, and they deliberately held their agenda back from the rank and file members, were people who actually had a different agenda. And their agenda, they were far more organized, far more strategic, and their agenda was to create the circumstances for a race war. and it was actually a religious agenda. And Miltier was one of those people.
Right, and there was also, in with that, intermingled with those kind of guys, were also a lot of sort of con men, too. I mean, there were individuals that ended up pushing that agenda and sort of playing on the sentiments of some of the individuals that were more those street-level racist guys that, that wanted to do something and collecting their money and in essence disappearing eventually, right, too?
Yeah, well, the fascinating thing, there's instances where Sam Bowers is reported as directly saying that the typical Mississippi redneck doesn't know what he's doing. I have to manipulate them to do what needs to be done. And Sam Bowers was the head of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Mississippi. You have similar sentiments sometimes expressed by people like J.B. Stoner. They definitely had this sense that they could manipulate, rile up, manipulate and sort of position the rank and file members to do what they wanted without having to tell the rank and file members exactly what it is they were doing.
Mm. And that, like I said, that was sort of a mixed bag of individuals. And this is not exactly the typical sort of, scenario that's drawn out by a lot of people where, they tie everything back to the government or to the FBI or all that, straight away. Some of this stuff, some of the actual on the ground stuff that was going on was more of a social construct sort of grown out of the conflict of the time, right?
Yes. And what people have to understand is that there were people that you never hear their names, incredibly influential in that white supremacist movement. And, it's very much anti-government in many ways. What they were hoping to do was actually calm the government. They sort of wanted to create a cycle of violence where they would do some kind of act of provocative violence. We call it propaganda of the deed. And that would then, they hoped, and this runs counter to almost all of the sentiment that Southerners were practically raised on. They were hoping that there would be federal intervention, that would then rile up the everyday Southerner, white Southerner. There would be a cycle of retaliation. They would then bring in, and I'm not making this up, this is documented. They would then they would polarize the races. This is their dream. And you get black nationalists versus white supremacists versus rank and file whites, and you'd get a race war. So they were hoping to manipulate the government as well as the rank and file white supremacists.
Well, see, and that is awfully counterintuitive because it seemed to me that the general population, now this may be a misreading on my part because I'm looking back at it and sort of trying to gauge the sentiments of the people at the time. But the thing is that it seemed to me as though the general rank and file whites, as you described them, were really against the idea of having federal intervention in any way, weren't they?
Absolutely. And so what the manipulation was on the part of somebody like Sam Bowers, who again ran the White Knights, was his goal was to do some provocative act of violence. To the rank and file members, it would just be, puffing your chest out in defiance of integration. But Bowers and others realized that if they could just sort of escalate the antagonism and do something so provocative that the government would be forced to send in federal troops. And that point, it wouldn't be what the rank and file Southerner wanted. It would be what Sam Bowers wanted. He wanted that exact resentment to happen, that you basically manipulate the rank and file Southerner into doing some provocative violence under the auspices of showing the world just how much you hate integration. They don't realize that that's going to eventually engender federal intervention. The federal intervention would further inflame the sort of everyday white Southerner, not even just the Klan members. And then you get, the kind of widespread disobedience that you saw during Reconstruction. And then you get maybe cycles of retaliation and violence that would lead to a race war. And I'm not just making this up, and I'm not saying that they actually had it right, but that was what their vision was. And there are people, more than one, who can be directly quoted as saying that that's what their goal was.
Well, right.
And they deliberately kept it from the rank and file members.
And in the literature at the time, some of the more inflammatory literature that was being circulated among some of the supremacist groups, you could see that it wasn't really all that well hidden in some cases, that they sort of wanted to almost create another civil war atmosphere, in order to create, more chaos actually. And then, obviously the government would have to step in to restore order and all these kind of things. This was almost, laid out in plain language among some of the members in the more organized groups, right?
You'd have to look at the right kind of group. So if you looked at sort of the publications of the National States Rights Party, the Thunderbolt was their, and they were a group that with their, pleasant politically sounding name, that was actually more violent than most Klan groups. And they would talk in that language, maybe not as, directly, but they would talk in that language because their members were more extreme. Somebody like Sam Bowers really had to pull some games. And you can see it because the other element of this sort of religiously minded group who wanted a race war because that's what they saw as as sort of the end times in in their version of Christian theology. And so they actually hated Jews and targeted Jews just as much as they wanted to target blacks. But in the early days of the height of the civil rights movement, 63, 64, 65, Bowers couldn't get the white knights to target Jews. He wanted them almost to primarily target Jews. But it wasn't until their membership dwindled that he could push them in that direction. And again, it's a religious, it's very much as Al-Qaeda has visions of a religious, some kind of religious end to the times, these folks did.
So this was more like the fundamentalist Christian sort of idea of bringing on the apocalypse in a way.
Yes, so we're dealing with a group that calls themselves the Christian Identity Movement. They're still active. Mm-hmm. They are still the Church of the Aryan Nations, and their version of the end times is different than the everyday fundamentalist version of the end times. They both believe there's an end times, but it's what they believe about the book of Genesis that's different. In the Christian Identity Movement, they believe that there were two separate relationships in the Garden of Eden. One was with Adam and Eve, and one was with Eve and the serpent. And that in their theology, Jews are descendants of Eve and the serpent. They're satanic. They're part of some satanic conspiracy to control the world. And that minority groups are descendants. They're not human either. They're descendants of the beasts of the field that roamed the world before Adam and Eve procreated. And that Jews have been engaged in a multi-century cosmic conspiracy against the true chosen people, Anglo-Saxon whites. Armageddon in their end times philosophy is basically ridding the world or ethnically cleansing Jews and blacks and minority groups. And that will usher in the second coming of Jesus.
And do you think that the people that were really in control of this actually believed this, or do you think
yes,
they were simply...
this was not a veneer. That religion had been in place for 70, 80 years. It was not the, even longer, the Americanized version that was very anti-Semitic and anti-minority, has been around for, now it's going on 90 years. It was started in England in 1870s. And these were sincerely religious people. They had their own church. They had their own sermons. They had their own ministers. And they spoke to, and there are people who were former members. They said it was religious zeal. As certain as anybody who is part of a jihad.
I have always felt that zealotry on any level in these religions is a highly dangerous aspect that is often ignored by others who sort of comport with those religions, and this ends up playing itself out. But how exactly does this begin to lead into what, why King became a target and all of that? Because we're all familiar with the general sort of stories that are associated with King, the idea of the "I have a dream" speech, and the concept, the very cursory sort of examination of his speeches and his philosophies, which gives us the ideas of integration and all that. But then there was a sort of a shift at some point here, and isn't that where really this comes into play much more?
Well, I would argue to you that to them, right from the start, and we trace for 10 years very serious plots against Martin Luther King's life, and this is sort of one of the areas that convinced us to look in the direction we were looking. What we discovered when we looked deeper is there's only 1 to 2 degrees of separation in virtually every major plot against King's life, going back to the late 50s. And it all goes back to this Church of Jesus Christ Christian. And really what the shift that mattered to these folks, although and let me be clear, there are conventional histories of domestic terrorism in the United States that don't have anything to do with the King assassination or whatever, where the historian says that the militant version of this particular Christian identity group had killing King as their goal from the very start. And that's because they saw King as an agent of the Jews. But what the shift that matters to them is the shift that starts happening in 1965, 1966, and 1967, even though they had targeted King before then. The shift that matters to them is the urban riots that are happening in the United States. And I can refer you, our book quotes, examples where they openly refer to those riots as sort of the foreshadowing of the end times. Because remember, in their minds, what's the end times is a race war. And even both our government and these folks saw the over 140 urban riots in 1967 alone as a potential race war ready to happen. And it's crazy from our perspective nowadays, not so crazy from the perspective maybe back then. The difference between the two groups is that became the major national security focus of our country in the late 1960s, if you look through the documents. It was to stop to prepare and stop such a race war from happening. On the reverse side, this particular subculture of white supremacists saw it as an opportunity, as sort of as cosmic signs from God that you're going to have an end times race war. They wanted to help make it happen. And killing King, when you think about it, in 1968, to their perspective, I'll explain in a second, I'm not just making this up. Killing King, from their perspective, was how that one major way you can make that happen, because you would be removing the one last sort of nonviolent voice of nonviolence, major voice from the scene, leaving only militants on both sides. Yeah, because by 1968, civil rights movement had been split between, and this is nothing new to anybody who's probably listening, split between the folks who supported Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach and the more militant folks, the Stokely Carmichaels, the Black Panthers, etc.
Right. Well, by the time King was killed, I mean, in all honesty, if you put him in proper perspective at that point, he wasn't so radical. He was more middle of the road, considering what was coming up at that point, right? I mean,
he was definitely middle of the road in terms of tactics. He had increasingly called for a much greater socioeconomic investment from the country. I think 300% increase in social services. Now that's not quite what the Black Panthers were saying. I mean, the Black Panthers were for revolutionary Marxism in many cases, but relative to, say, you know, your rank and file liberal today, he was probably more radical than many people realize. But that's only in messaging. In terms of approach, he was still ardently nonviolent.
So the message was still pretty radical for the time, but his actual mechanism by which he was doing battle, let's just say, with the established racial and economic, and even so far as his ways of protesting the Vietnam War, all of these things were fairly moderate, but his statements were still pretty extreme.
Absolutely. He would say things like in case of the Vietnam War, that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. Not on earth, in the world. He would again call for massive reinvestment in socioeconomic issues, but he wasn't as extreme on that as, say, maybe the Black Panthers were. And he certainly, again, was never one who was in favor of the riots. He understood where the riots were coming from. He said riots are the voice of the oppressed, but he did not believe that violence was ever an answer.
Well, this was during the same time period that he was saying that, a country that spends, well, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the quote exactly, but I do remember listening to this speech many times, and it's been cited many times, that he was saying that a country which decides to spend more on killing people than helping people essentially is approaching spiritual death. That's about the same time period, right?
Absolutely. Yes. He was openly talking about shifting from, sort of a military footing and just really doubling and tripling down on something like the Great Society.
Well, that is definitely worth noting. And what was the sort of price that he was paying at that point? Would you say for what was going on and his sort of shift at that point to sort of discussing the broader issues of Vietnam and the broader issues of warfare in general, and even the Poor People's Campaign and all that. What do you think the price he paid was for that?
It was an enormous price. He knew he was paying an enormous price. First off, it basically ruined his relationships in Washington, D.C. There was an extent to which, Lyndon Johnson was something of a benefactor of Martin Luther King. But once Martin Luther King starts making these changes, obviously Lyndon Johnson's no longer in his camp. Many liberals, especially sort of the strong anti-communist liberals, abandoned King. Many people who were moderate or open on the race issue were very much opposed to the extent to which he was talking about Poor People's Campaign and the socioeconomic issues. And it was to a point by 1968, Cornel West, the great professor, always likes to point out that there were polls that indicated that Martin Luther King had a majority unfavorable rating with whites by 1968. And then by not being willing to embrace any kind of militancy in tactics, he was also losing esteem with some in the black community. He knew that in both cases he was bucking the national popular view, and he was still willing to go forward. He was not willing to shift his focus, even though people told him that taking those stances would hurt his reputation with certain core constituencies. He still stuck to his convictions.
Yeah, see, I have noted this before, that there was a serious change which I don't think is often enough mentioned, that he was sort of turning what was considered his own people at the time, and even the supporters who were sort of neutral, because it was sort of like the people that were on his side, the people that he was speaking out for, let's just say in the black community, essentially thought he was being too weak, on many issues here and not focusing on going further like he was supposed to. And at the same time, the supporters among the white population who were all for, let's just say, the idea of equality, started to view him as almost anti-American, which caused a lot of them to turn their backs on him. I mean, does that seem like a fair statement to you?
Yeah, it's the way I always think it is the approach he took alienated groups such as SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and had overtly advocated, for violence as a potential tactic by the late 1960s. He had alienated them with his tactics, and he alienated the white audiences, not all of them, but to a large extent, with the substance of his message. So, and he was aware. And in 68, he was probably at the bottom of his popularity and influence relative to the rest of his civil rights career.
Because overall, he had alienated people that were on a couple of different sides of that issue. I mean, this wasn't, a sort of two-way, like on one side of the line or the other, but this was a multi-dimensional issue at the time. So there were some people who were sort of moderately in support of him. There were some people that were strongly in support of him, but he was starting to alienate everybody with this.
Right. And in hindsight, I think a lot of people look back, and I certainly do, with great admiration at his willingness to put all those things on the line for what he believed. Because he could have just rode the wave after 65 and, just worked on, modest civil rights issues like he continued to do with like the 68 Civil Rights Act. But he was not going to, he was not going to ignore Vietnam, and he was not going to ignore the socioeconomic situation in the African American community.
Right. So, I mean, if he could have toned a few things down, basically, he could have kept some of his mainstream allies, and some of his political allies would have remained in his camp. Sort of like, like you mentioned, the Johnson administration, there was a lot of problems there because they certainly didn't want to seem as though they were, in bed with somebody who at the same time was against them on this very divisive issue of Vietnam. I mean, that's an obvious problem there. And then there was just loss of support. There was probably loss of financial backing and everything else, right?
Oh, yeah. And what a lot of people don't know, and it's covered very well in Gerald McKnight's book on the Poor People's Campaign, is he was struggling with the Poor People's Campaign. He had announced it the previous year, and, it was a few weeks away at the time he died, and he was very worried. One of the reasons he went back to Memphis was to show that nonviolence could work, because the previous time he had been in Memphis for the sanitation workers strike, it had broken out in violence. And he was worried that the Poor People's Campaign was so tenuous that would undermine its legitimacy. And he was, I know, because I've talked to people in, say, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, he was actively trying to get people to help him with grassroots mobilization within a week of his death, because he was worried he wouldn't have the level of support when it came time to actually go to D.C. with the Poor People's Campaign.
And that first strike in Memphis was where the famous imagery comes, where we see the men walking around with the placards that say, "I am a man," right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was just making that reference just for people listening, because that's what that first time in Memphis was, where it had gotten out of hand and had broken down into it had sort of devolved into a bunch of violent clashes in the street and everything, right?
Yes, it got violent. King actually had to leave the city, and it was looked at as an embarrassment for him. And that's when he decided that he had to go back, and he had to lead another march, and it had to be nonviolent, and it had to hold. It had to remain disciplined and nonviolent, because he was looking ahead to the Poor People's Campaign, and he wanted to make sure that its legitimacy was not questioned, so that he didn't lose any support for it going to Washington.
Mm. quite a situation to be in. And like I say, just sort of examining this, and as you said, sort of examining just this very small, part of his career, let's just say, as a political activist, you have to sort of give some respect, regardless of whether you agreed with his viewpoint or you thought that the entire aims of what he was doing were, in the right vein at that particular moment. The fact is, the guy defied conventional wisdom for sure, and then on top of it, even started to defy his own allies to follow through on the stuff he believed in.
Absolutely. Very few people I know and studied in history had the courage of their convictions to the degree that Dr. King did, in my opinion.
Definitely worth noting. So as we continue on with this, so he returns back to Memphis, and I'm sure that you spent some time studying what happened there. There's been a lot of different stories that have circulated about that entire situation, and I'm curious to know what you make of some of these things, like the idea that he was going to stay at a different motel, and there were all these sort of different accusations about the amount of surveillance that was on him and all that kind of stuff. I mean, what do you want to say about that?
Well, I think there's a lot of misinformation and myths out there. First off, the hotel. Ralph Abernathy, who was probably his closest friend and his right-hand man, to this day refers to the place they stayed to as the King Abernathy Suite. And you can follow the documentation. The motel owner said King stayed there all the time. So the idea that he never stayed there, it's rooted in one, reporter's fuzzy recollection. I'll take Ralph Abernathy and the owner of the motel over that fuzzy recollection every time.
That was the gentleman whose wife's name was actually Lorraine, right?
The Lorraine Motel, yes. Correct.
Okay.
In terms of security, the first thing is that there was so much sort of distrust and understandable distrust and between the King entourage and the Memphis police owing to the strike that they themselves, and Jerry McKnight writes about this as well, and it's all over the place, they themselves asked for the security detail to back off. The third thing that often gets brought up is this surveillance with police officer Ed Reddit. And it's indeed a suspicious situation, but we were able to come up with a much better explanation for it, I believe, than what's in the conventional books. Ed Reddit was a Memphis police officer. He and his partner were they were sort of they were sort of spies. They basically surveilled the civil rights movement and the strike and the union movement, labor movement in Memphis. And everybody thinks that they were security, but Reddit was not security. He was there to spy on King. And that's all documented. Reddit admitted it to the HSCA. It gets distorted in a lot of the books. And so what happened was indeed suspicious. Somebody from Washington, D.C., an aide to a senator, Senator McClellan, came down and reported that there was a threat against Ed Reddit's life. This is on the day of the assassination, April 4th, from, of all groups, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And that caused the folks to remove Reddit, the folks being the Memphis police, remove Reddit from the detail and to protect him, to potentially save his life. And so this has been used as an argument that there was security stripping. But two things. One, they didn't remove Reddit's partner. Two, it wasn't meant, again, to protect King. They were just surveilling him. There was nothing those two guys could have done to stop a shooting of Martin Luther King.
Well, plus Reddit, I think, was also, it's kind of known, if you examine the stuff a little bit, he was involved in not just spying on King, but in other instances, like even the other groups in town. I mean, the one that comes to mind immediately was the Invaders. obviously, for obvious connections to this, which I do want you to cover at some point a little bit here. But the thing is, he wasn't just involved in looking in on King whenever he came to town. He was involved in all of this stuff when it came down to the strikes. And
that's why they thought that, and it was well known, like his cover was sort of blown. So that's why the claim that his life was in danger from a civil rights activist groups had some credibility and some purchase with the Memphis police, which actually leads to the second argument that where there's security stripping claimed, which is with the two firemen. But it became very clear that what had happened was the two firemen who were removed from sort of not security, but again, an area that could have been used to possibly surveil King. Those two firemen were removed because they had openly confronted Ed Reddit about what he was doing with the civil rights and union and labor activists in Memphis, and Reddit himself asked for those two people to be removed. Reddit admitted that. They said it in both under oath. So there's no mystery to why the firemen were removed. There's no mystery. There is one remaining mystery as to with Ed Reddit, because it wouldn't have been anything remaining having to do with protecting King's life. Again, because his partner was left on surveillance. The mystery is why would this story about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which turned out to be untrue, why was it provided to the Memphis police? And, people tend to look at the guy who made the report. His name is Philip Manuel. I've actually spoken to him on the phone. They tend to focus on the fact that years and years before, Manuel was in military intelligence. They almost never mention the fact of what was Manuel doing that year. He was one of the main aides to Senator McClellan from Arkansas, who was a segregationist to the nth degree. Well, as we document in the book, McClellan was known to resort to dirty tricks to try and sabotage the civil rights movement and King's movement and the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. Why would you send somebody to threaten the life of Ed Reddit when it wasn't true? Well, on that very day, there was an injunction that was put out against King's March. And that kind of injunction does not have a very good chance of withstanding constitutional scrutiny unless you can show that there is very likely to be a direct act of violence connected with that whatever peaceful march is being prevented. So the most likely explanation in my mind as to what happened was this was yet another dirty trick by McClellan to try and keep the injunction against King in place in Memphis. And it failed.
Well, that makes a great deal more sense, actually, because, and also it has the added benefit of causing additional problems, because if that informant was already compromised, then you have a perfectly plausible explanation as to why he would have been threatened. And that can create an even greater effect among the rest of the potential individuals that might have any sort of a connection to this. Like you said, those two guys confronted Reddit. So that makes a whole lot of sense to me.
Yes. Yeah. And other researchers have pointed this out. Philip Mellinson was the first. There was nothing Reddit could have done to stop, or his partner, to stop a sniper shooting. And removing Reddit and not his partner makes no sense if it's trying to security strip for King. Especially because they weren't on security detail. The thing that makes sense is you're trying to stop you're trying to actually reinforce the injunction that's on King.
Bolstering the injunction in that there's a legitimate threat to someone's life, or there's a legitimate threat of violence in place, which is a reasonable means by which they would stop the march. But otherwise it would be sort of a First Amendment issue without that added sort of caveat that there's the potential for violence and it's known, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, it was coming from a Senate aide who had been doing this kind of thing for several months. Now, he didn't admit that to me, by the way. He was very coy. But I don't think he would admit it either way.
Well, that's like trying to get, most times you can't get one of these guys to really admit the seriously dirty stuff that they had their hands in. you got to kind of read between the lines when you talk to these guys.
Absolutely.
And generally, even when you pin them down, I mean, just from my own experiences, I got to tell you that even if you pin them down to, look, you've only got between these two posts to run, and there's only one explanation for this, they'll still try and slip out of it. I mean, because they don't want to own up to any of their own, even if it's not prosecutable or whatever at this point, they don't want to own up to this stuff. So,
right.
Yeah, that's true. So continuing on, that's the security stripping angle, and that's really a logical explanation for why that all occurred. And, like you said, credit where credit's due. I mean, Melanson brought this up at one point, and McKnight also covered this.
Yeah, McKnight does an excellent job of sort of taking on a lot of the myths on King and security in Memphis, and he was a big source for our book. He wrote the foreword to our book.
Wow. Well, so continuing on with the story, like I said, we have the situation in Memphis. King returns there. And what did you discover from there? I mean, outside of, the whole, we knew about the dinner the night before, or the day before, and the planned meal that he was supposed to be going to, right? I mean, what did you discover about all that stuff?
Well, part of it is fuzzy. We in the book were careful to outline a few possible scenarios for what actually happened on the day Martin Luther King was shot. But the one that I lean to now, but again, I would be hard pressed to prove it, is I think what happened that day happened in a way that wasn't supposed to happen. It surprised the conspirators. And I don't think what happened was well thought out when it happened. So there's sort of three possibilities. There's the one that James Earl Ray asserted, which was he was completely set up by this figure he called Raoul, and Raoul let him go on his merry way, and then somebody else shot King. And if you take William Pepper's argument with a different rifle, and that's how it went down. And that was from the bushes, right near the Lorraine, right near the Betsy Brewer's motel, which was across the street from the Lorraine Motel where King was shot. There's the idea that, it was all James Earl Ray from the start, finish and end. Maybe his brothers had something to do with it, but he had been planning to shoot King for a while. He shoots him, escapes, etc. And then I lean towards the probability that what happened was that Ray was on the periphery of an assassination plot that involved a lot of money, that Ray saw his opportunity to potentially sort of rashly make more money by being an actual shooter. And this is where I run afoul of a lot of other folks. But again, I'm not 100% certain of it. And I believe that what probably happened was that Ray indeed took the shot and succeeded, but did not have a very clear plan of action as to how he would get the money. And that the conspirators, who were probably intending on killing King in a different way, probably in Memphis, but at a different time, were caught scrambling. And I have a lot of sort of reasons for why I go with that, and I'm happy to go into them, if you want me to. And also why I don't believe the other two theories also.
Well, I definitely want to cover that, but I want to just address one thing, because I've always had a hard time understanding how the sort of official scenario could have occurred, because looking at the way the bathroom was originally laid out, not the way that they did it in the Civil Rights Museum later, but the way it was laid out, I mean, it seems to be a really awkwardly difficult way that James Earl Ray potentially could have even taken that shot.
Well, I think that's been, in a way, distorted. Sometimes prosecutors come up with crazy theories. Or investigators to explain what they think is evidence of a crime. And there's an alternative that still supports their view. I go back to the O.J. Simpson case, for instance. If you look at the differences between the scenario set up in the criminal trial and what they came up with in they being the folks who sued O.J. Simpson in the civil trial, the folks in the civil trial came up with a much more logical scenario to fit the evidence than what the folks in the criminal trial did. And I think part of the issue was people see these shoe prints in the bathtub, and somebody, the prosecutors floated the theory that whoever it was had to stand in the tub and mount their weapon on the windowsill, and then it created some kind of dent in the windowsill and they fired. But the military channel did a precise recreation, and instead of standing in the tub, they had somebody sit in between the tub and the window. And it wasn't a tremendous amount of room, but there was enough. They gave the rifle to somebody who literally had never fired a gun in his life. And once after the first shot, he figured out how the gun worked. He scored a bullseye on the next shot. Just sitting on the bathtub, gently resting the gun on the windowsill, didn't have to create any dent, and firing the shot out. But prosecutors try and explain every single thing at a crime scene, and sometimes they come away with crazy theories.
Well, yeah, that was part of the problem. The other part of the problem, and again, I'm not an expert on this, so these are just questions I have just from some examination of some of the evidence other people have sort of brought up. But the thing is, one of the other things that has always stuck with me is the Charles Stevens testimony and what kind of shape he was in, and he being the only witness too. I mean, that was the other.
But the thing is, people are at. What Charles Stevens is the only witness who could give a positive ID of whoever it was who ran out of that building. Right? No one denies somebody ran out of that building. What they forget is that there's a couple of other witnesses who didn't positively identify the person because they didn't see him. And I agree, Charles Stevens was drunk. But there's another witness, a Charles Anschutz, who was in the room right near where the bathroom was. And Charles Anschutz said for a very long time, he could not get into the bathroom. It was a rooming house bathroom. And he even asked Charles Stevens, what the heck is the deal with the guy in the rooming house bathroom? Why won't this guy get out? And Stevens, as drunk as he was, according to Anschutz, said it was the guy in, I think, 5B, which would have been the room that Ray had rented. And more than one person saw somebody run out. They just didn't get a good idea of who it was.
Yeah, I've seen that. That a lot of people knew that there was somebody that ran out of there.
So then I always ask people this question. And I hope people at home who are open-minded, and this is something, again, I was somebody who was very open to the idea of shot from the bushes, Ray innocent, Raoul frame up, going into, say, 2004. But three things to think about common sense logic-wise. First off, if Ray is correct, and he delivered a rifle to somebody that was a perfectly fine, excellent hunting rifle called the Game Master, why wouldn't somebody shoot with that rifle? One. Two, because again, the goal is to frame Ray, right? You have his fingerprints on the rifle he bought.
Right.
Why would you shoot another rifle? Two, this is, I think, the bigger one. Why would you let James Earl Ray go off, unassisted, unwatched, unsupervised, to do whatever the heck he wanted, and then go ahead and shoot Martin Luther King? Ray could have been in a restaurant with 50 people and had an alibi. Instead, what we're left with was an alibi that for 50 years has never been verified. And in fact, there are reasons to question. So that's two. Three, why in the world would you risk somebody running from the bathroom window down the stairs as a decoy when that person could be tripped, caught, taken by police, and your conspiracy would have been unraveled that day? Why not just have somebody shoot from the bushes? And I'm not sure those bushes were necessarily the greatest place to shoot. Again, it's wide. You're covered by bushes, but you're still out in the open.
Well,
when you have to flee the scene.
Yeah, when I examined some of the landscape there, I thought that there was much better places to shoot from atop a couple of the buildings, really.
And that may be the case, but I'm also of the opinion that and this is part of it, I think it would have been stupid to shoot from a bathroom window, from a bathroom in a rooming house, for the very reasons that I described. People are going to want to use that bathroom. It's an open bathroom for everybody in the rooming house. But that's part of the reason why I think this thing was a last minute, let me see if I can, Ray maybe thinking about it over a few days. Why am I letting these people get all the money? Why don't I get all the money? And that would explain a lot of things. I mean, one of the things that people always cite, and I think it's maybe the strongest evidence for a conspiracy in the crime, is the radio broadcast that happened in Memphis. Do you recall that?
You mean about the other white Mustang?
Right. So somebody went on the radio and got the Memphis police to go on a wild goose chase, literally, after another vehicle that it turned out to be completely untrue. Now, the Memphis police tried to claim that this was a hoax, but Congress investigated it thoroughly and concluded it could not have been a hoax. But they also said that even though it reeks of conspiratorial implications, whoever it was was a CB radio operator who didn't use the normal procedures of a CB radio operator, who led people in the exact opposite direction from which Ray would have been heading. And it was problematic, but the Congress said, this couldn't have been a conspiratorial act because it happened a full half hour after the shooting. Why wouldn't they have done it right away? It didn't actually benefit Ray in the time frame, or whoever it was fleeing, whatever it was. So, and that's Posner's argument too. Well, and my counter argument is, if you go by the idea that this was something that was not fully planned out or thought out, that it caught the rest of the conspirators literally by surprise, it was literally jumping the gun, then a half-hour delay makes a lot of sense, because what would have happened is the conspirators would have been trying to figure out and scrambling, why did this happen at 4 p.m. and not at 6 p.m. Why didn't it happen hypothetically like we wanted it to right in the middle of the march?
Well, right. And all you have to really add into the equation ultimately is that certain things that were planned did not go off as planned. And that's not too hard to imagine here.
Right. But I would imagine that something like that, if it happened a half hour later, was a scramble. Again, it's speculative. But a lot of things make sense from the speculative point of view. So when Ray goes into the rooming house, first off, his story is that Raul told him to go meet him at the rooming house, right? Mm-hmm. But Ray rents a room without even checking to see if Raul did in the real life. So if that's true, why would Ray not check to see if somebody else had checked in for him? And when Ray rents the room, he on the one hand, he deliberately asks for a room on the opposite, he was offered a room opposite not facing the Lorraine. And he specifically asks for a room that is facing the Lorraine.
Well, see, I could say this, that in all honesty, if you have someone who is generally controlled in some cases, they very blindly do things on occasion where they don't, verify and double check things. But the fact that he did switch his room does lead you in the other direction for sure.
Right, and there's some side justifications for why he wouldn't have taken the room he did. But on a flip, he took a room that he didn't check to see if it had a clear view of the Lorraine, and it doesn't have a very clear view. Mm. So I guess what I'm trying to say is everything he's doing is suggesting he's doing it at the last minute. Even if he goes, even going to Lorraine at 4. I have a big problem, thousands of problems with the Raoul story. And again, one of my biggest is, it was having successfully, masterfully manipulated James Earl Ray into a complete and total setup. You let him just go on his merry way right around the time you're going to shoot King.
Well, that's
you
always,
don't know where he's going to be.
Yeah, that's
and
always,
why, if you're per Pepper going to shoot him, would you not use the rifle that he bought and has his fingerprints on it?
Well, see, I might be able to explain that, from sort of an understanding of the way some of these operations work. There's all kinds of reasonings as to why they would use a particular weapon as opposed to another weapon. But I think it's an extremely valid point that a lot of this stuff just came together without the preparation that would have normally been in place. I mean, okay, let's just say, for instance, he should have had, a couple of different views of where King was going to be. He probably wouldn't have just selected one sort of place to shoot from. Let's be honest. If that's what your goal is, you're going to try and get yourself a clear place where you can disappear, or you can be, camouflaged, let's just say, from the public, or from, pesky sort of, random bystander observation. And that kind of stuff. And the bathroom is actually a really poor place because, like you said, it's a shared bathroom on a floor of a rooming house. You're going to have other people knocking on the door. I mean, there is a lot of this that does smack of just sort of last minute, not being well planned out stuff that I've always felt a little strange about the Raoul story, because even though it seems somewhat plausible, it doesn't exactly sound like the type of thing where someone is being controlled. Let's just say that even if we accept that the Raoul character exists, and we accept that, that he had, reason for manipulating James Earl Ray or whatever else, the fact that this was such an important situation and he does not keep his control on him or keep a secondary person in place to sort of observe and guide Ray's movements is a problem, because after all, like you said, what is to stop Ray from wandering off and being somewhere where he could be spotted by anybody? I mean,
he could have a receipt. He could have a ticket in a movie.
Right. Or even, let's just say randomly, let's just say he's trying to do some reconnaissance on Martin Luther King. There is no way of them to know that there wouldn't be a reporter nearby, snap a picture of him.
Absolutely.
Catch a recording of him in some way or other in proximity to King, which would place him there. And that would be the kind of thing that a control agent would seek to avoid for sure.
Right. And I know, just not to divert too much, I mean, it's something that from the Kennedy assassination, which both you and I have studied a lot longer than King, I mean, you're going to make sure, and I think most people who are logical about the Kennedy assassination, you're going to make sure Lee Harvey Oswald is not in the crowd on the side, near the grassy knoll.
No,
you got to make sure that Lee Harvey Oswald is in a building if you're going to try and frame him. And a lot of people, for instance, would argue that he was told to be by the payphone or something like that. But none of that thing is being suggested by Ray. He wasn't told to be anywhere, to be to wait for somebody.
Well, that's the thing.
That would have kept.
Right. Even if you're giving him a diversionary sort of place to be, it then accounts for his whereabouts in a particular place. And you're telling him, let's just say he is waiting for that phone call in the case of Oswald. Then look, he's going to be in that building. He was told to be there. And meanwhile, usually they keep an eye on him too. So somebody else would be nearby to keep an eye on the guy. I mean,
right. And they would know for certain that he's not someplace where, he's in a picture with, that 500 people took, or smoking a cigarette on the Zapruder film or something like that. Right.
Right. Or at the very least, you would put in, a secondary control person to alert the others. Listen, our guy is not in position. Or,
right.
Or we need to adjust because he's done this or whatever. Even if they were just informing and not directly pushing him, there's no evidence for anybody informing on Ray or anything here, is there?
Right. And then you go to you add in the fact, two things. One, Ray gave an alibi that for 50 years no one's been able to verify. And, if you say you were at a gas station and your car was being worked on, he had Harold Weisberg, who I think everybody would acknowledge is one of the most diligent, thorough investigators you can find. Weisberg was never able to find who this person, where this gas station attendant is, and neither is Pepper. People have come forward and they've been discredited. And Ray claims he listened to, he fled because he wanted to avoid a police roadblock because he had heard about this assassination on the radio. Well, we have the FBI report from before Ray was even a suspect when they found the Mustang, and it reports that the radio wasn't in working condition. So, I guess you could broadly interpret that, but I asked all the folks out in the audience who are inclined or have a preconceived direction towards, say, the William Pepper theory, but are also Kennedy assassination devotees. If we had an FBI report that said that the Tippit gun wasn't in working condition, would we assume that meant that the rifle was, that the pistol wasn't able to fire well? Or would we assume that it had some scratches on it? I would think we'd assume that probably is a death knell for the Tippit shooting. And if somebody is saying that they heard something on a radio that is quote unquote not in working condition, my assumption is that there's no way they could have heard it on that radio.
Well, it's not a great leap of logic to assume that you would need a working radio to hear an announcement.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I'd add one other thing, which is on the Raoul front, and this gets ignored, I think, too much. In the 1970s, Ray all but positively identified the figure that we in the Kennedy assassination know as Frenchie, the figure, one of the tramps from the Grassy Knoll pictures.
Right.
Identifies Frenchie as being Raoul. Well, in the 90s, he positively identified a picture of a guy, Raoul. I actually have his name, but we won't mention it.
This is the guy that Pepper mentions.
Pepper identified.
Of Portuguese descent, that guy, right?
Yeah, first of all, that photo lineup was ridiculous, but that's besides the point. I ask anybody, I have it in our book, look at the picture of Frenchie and look at the picture of Raoul. They look absolutely nothing alike. So how could one guy, and that difference to me suggests that Ray is willing to say whatever is in vogue at any time and say that person is Raoul.
See, I've seen copies of these pictures, not in your book, but I've seen copies of these pictures separately. And I got to tell you, that is one of the things that has totally made me not believe the entire Raoul story, because the difference between these two guys, I don't even know how to explain it. But you're not even looking at the same ethnic, loosely even the same ethnic categories. If you look at the basic sort of structure of the face, nothing. You can't get two more discernibly different men.
Right. And I know, and you know from Kennedy assassination research, a big red light always goes, like a big flashing light always goes up for me whenever somebody starts bringing in the quote unquote usual customers into their stories in weird places.
Oh yeah. This is always the red flag, yeah.
so when James Files says something like, I saw Jack Ruby in my scope or something like that, that's when I start saying, oh God, this guy's read High Treason 1 and 2 one too many times, right?
Right.
When James O'Reilly in the early 70s starts talking about Frenchie, I get incredibly suspicious, especially because we now know who Frenchie was, and it was just some random, Canadian guy or something like it. It really, and then there's the fact, as Melanson has pointed out, Ray has given multiple descriptions of Raoul. And, he's changed his story about Raoul. He said that he bought the rifle in Birmingham, and Raoul, examined it, played around with it, looked through the scope, et cetera, gave it back to him and told him, bring this to Memphis, basically. Or it was, I'm maybe confusing that was the original rifle that he told him to return. Right. Then, when they told Ray that the only fingerprints on the rifle were his, Ray then claimed, "Oh, I'm sorry. All Raoul ever handled was the rifle in the box. He never touched the weapon." That kind of stuff really bothers me.
Right, because when you see people backtracking, and this has happened for me in a lot of cases where, I really call it letting the subject hang themselves, because I have known facts sometimes in my hands that I can verify 3 different ways. And I know that it should comport with their story in a certain way, so I just let them tell their story. And then after they've said it, I say, well, the one problem I have here, and the one thing that doesn't make sense, let's just say theoretically, is somebody says to me, well, for instance, Jack Ruby was in New Jersey on a particular day.
Right.
Okay. And I happen to know absolutely that he could not have been, because he was photographed, in Cuba. Okay.
Right.
And there's no way that was different, because I happen to know exactly what was going on in that picture, and that occurred on a particular day, which means that during this week that he says that Ruby was in New Jersey, he would have had to have also been in Cuba on Tuesday when he's saying that he saw Ruby late night Monday. That's impossible.
Absolutely.
So when that happens, and I confront them with it, and then they start to backpedal on their story, to be honest with you, you get a whole different look at that person, because usually they're scrambling for an explanation because they've just been called out on, I hate to say it, but they've just been called out on a lie. Absolutely. And then you start questioning a lot of the other things they're saying as well, and trying to, not debunk what they're saying necessarily, but you have to double and triple verify most of the stuff before you even produce it for anyone to look at. Because so often individuals graft things into their stories.
And I think we as JFK assassination people are probably a lot more sensitive to it than maybe folks coming from another realm. I've known a couple of occasions, and you've probably had this happen too, where the person's clearly fishing for me to try and give them the detail they don't know. And I refuse to do it. At least happened at least twice to me in JFK, where at that moment, I know the person's making up a story because they're trying to, be like a fortune teller and cold read me.
See, I'm a little more nasty to them sometimes, because I get fed up. And to be honest with you, sometimes I feed them something that I intentionally know is wrong.
Right. Well, and I've known people who've done that too. And then suddenly it starts getting repeated, and that's when you know that the person's going to hang their hat on whatever it is they can find in the literature or from researchers and graft a story around it, like you said. Right. And I see that happening all the time with Ray. What's interesting is, Harold Weisberg, who's a whole lot more sympathetic to Ray than I am, and who was his chief investigator, and who I have an enormous amount of respect for. You can find private letters of his now that he has after he died on the Hood website, where he flat out says, you got to be careful with James Earl Ray. He's covering for people. He will lie for them, etc. And he's somebody who's a whole lot more sympathetic to him than I am. Even William Pepper in his book at points says, well, sometimes James tells tall tales. Or, he has a weird sense of humor. Because, for instance, his original alibi was that that Raoul picked him up in a car and he hid underneath a bedsheet. And he claimed that was just him joking with the author, William Huey, he heard that Huey was exploring a Klan theory. But Ray's telling this to Huey through his attorney who has to defend him against a death penalty charge, I don't know how much I'd be joking about my alibi.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely suspect. And I mean, for those who don't know, I mean, William Pepper wrote a couple of books about this, and like I said, represented him in the civil suit, the King family, and also attempted to get a retrial for James Earl Ray prior to his death. But even a guy who was clearly very sympathetic, obviously, because he devoted a great deal of his time to this, you know, on a real level, also knew that everything that came out of the guy's mouth could not be trusted. And that's something that I think is definitely worth noting. And also Weisberg, the stuff that you're talking about that's available at Hood, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff in his papers there that you can find about this, for sure. I mean, a lot of other things as well, but that's something that I wasn't aware of, that Weisberg had also come to that conclusion as well.
Well, I mean, and again, Weisberg didn't, you know, he thought, you know, Ray was largely a dupe, and I don't. But when Weisberg says, I think he's covering for somebody, my question to people who think that there was a government conspiracy is, well, every attorney he ever had, every book he ever wrote implicated the government. So if Ray is covering for somebody, and I don't necessarily dispute that he wasn't, I sure as heck don't think it's the government. If you're worried that the government's going to do something to you, you don't hire Mark Lane as your attorney.
That is a good point. That is an extremely good point right there. And he was actually disqualified from representing him, I think, with the House Select Committee?
Well, the interest, I'm not 100% sure of disqualified. I know Jim Lassar represented him and Ray in some cases, definitely represented Ray's brothers. But, you know, there's the other interesting thing about the alibi and the House Select Committee that I've always wanted Mark Lane to address. And I've tried to get it through to him and it's never happened. And maybe he can't say it for attorney-client privilege. But, you know, there was another alibi that came out during the House Select Committee that turned out to be completely a hoax. And it was at the behest of Mark Lane. I mean, Mark Lane was the one who put it out there. He was the one who was embarrassed by it. And I've always said to myself, you know, one thing you know about Mark Lane is a darn good attorney.
Right. When
Gerald Posner, who went after you like nobody's business in Case Closed, hires you as his attorney, and says that he thinks you could have gotten Lee Harvey Oswald off. You're a very good attorney. And I don't know a very good attorney who would come forward with an alibi witness, two of them, for his client without first going to his client with the alibi. And if he did, and we don't know, again, we don't know either way, so either Mark Lane was extremely incompetent and brought forth an alibi witness without once going to James Earl Ray to verify it, or James Earl Ray once again lied about his alibi when it was convenient in 1970s. One of those two things happened. I'd be very interested to hear what Mark Lane has to say about it. Did he put forth an alibi without even bothering to go to his own client and ask that client, do you know these two people? Do you remember them?
Right, because if he didn't, that would have been irresponsible on his part. But
right, and it wound up blowing up in his face.
And if he had gone to Ray, then it would be reasonable.
Right,
wow.
and then it wouldn't have been reasonable. I mean, then there's only two choices then. Either Ray lied to him,
Okay there?
Oh yeah, I'm fine.
All right. I'm sorry about that. So go on with the situation we were discussing. Either Mark Lane had presented a spurious sort of alibi, or he had been misled by his client. It seems one of these two things seems to be absolutely true.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'd love to know what Mark Lane's answer to that is.
Yeah.
But I don't know if he can even say attorney-client privilege, but that's something always that stood out to me.
Right. It's possible that he might not be capable of doing so. And I apologize to the listeners. I just lost the connection there for a few minutes. I actually lost Stu and everybody there for a second. Sorry, guys. But we're continuing on with this discussion. And so back to those 3 points, though. Oh, okay. We have a caller calling in. I don't know if you want to address the caller directly right away. Let's see. Caller, you there?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I'm also on UCY. I do a show on Sunday morning. I saw this you go through all these different things on Facebook, different things like that, and there was actually a picture there, and it said that Martin Luther King's family had gotten in some kind of civil suit. They had gotten some kind of money paid to them, that kind of, because the government, it basically on some level said that the government had something to do with MLK's murder. So they had actually gotten money paid to them. There was some kind of civil suit or something. Is that anything that you guys are aware of? I saw it, and I tuned in tonight to listen to the program, which is excellent. There's so much information here about the MLK and JFK. What are your thoughts on that, or do you know anything about that?
Well, that was precisely what we were addressing with William Pepper. I had mentioned the civil suit. That was in, right, I believe, 1999, right, Stu?
Yes, and in our book, Awful Grace of God, we actually have a whole appendix that more or less deals primarily with that trial. So what had happened was in the early 90s, William Pepper had developed a witness by the name of Lloyd Jowers, who owned a grill right near the Lorraine, who said that he was paid money to basically assist in the King assassination by the New Orleans Mafia kingpin Carlos Marcello. And what had happened was, first off, there was a whole lot of things that happened in the early 90s. William Pepper actually got sued for a book he wrote that included accusations against military special forces as being involved in the King assassination, and Pepper lost. But Pepper got the ear of the King family, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, and he convinced them to sue Jowers and the person he believed was Raoul. First thing is, the judge found the evidence against Raoul so spurious that element of the case wasn't even allowed to go forward. But the Jowers element of the case was allowed to go forward. It was not a direct accusation against the government, but Pepper did attempt to introduce evidence that this was like some kind of combo conspiracy involving the Marcello Mafia and sort of the national security state, or the military industrial complex, or however you want to refer to it. But there's problems with that trial, and the biggest one is this. The King family wasn't interested in getting a ton of money in a wrongful death suit. They were interested in trying to expose what happened to their husband and to their father. And again, I have a tremendous amount of respect for them. The problem is in Pepper's own book, Pepper admits, one, that Jowers was looking to make a lot of money off of a movie script or a book deal based on his confession to kill Martin Luther King. And two, that Jowers was openly lied, including accusing a completely innocent person of being the shooter, in the early 90s in connection with this effort to make money off of a script. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem is if you sue somebody for nothing and they want legitimacy in trying to pursue $150,000 for a movie or a book deal, then there's incentive on both sides to basically pursue the same outcome, which is Lloyd Jowers being found guilty. So what you had was a trial that was not adversarial. And American jurisprudence gets its sort of legitimacy by the fact that both sides challenge each other openly. We, for instance, in the assassination community, we have big problems with the Sirhan trial because Sirhan's lawyer was practically giving the case away to the other side.
Yeah.
Those same folks who have problems with the Sirhan trial should have the same exact concerns about the civil trial in the 90s, and even probably more. Let me just give you one example. I'm not just throwing this out there. Two things that happened in this civil trial that would have never happened if both sides weren't basically trying to pursue the same thing. First, there were basically no legal objections from either side. So the stuff you see on courtroom dramas like objection, Your Honor, no foundation, cause for speculation, badgering the witness. Neither side did that basically at all through multiple days on the trial. I went back to the O.J. Simpson civil trial. There were dozens on the first day. That's an adversarial trial. The one we saw was not adversarial. The other thing that happened.
Right? I mean, it's unheard of to go through a case, a trial like that, and have not either side to object. That's something you would expect. You had none of that.
Yeah, none of that.
Right.
And one of the things that should have been definitely objected to was one of the main witnesses for against Jowers was a woman named Glenda Grabow. And Grabow has all sorts of credibility problems, but the bigger issue is in that trial, the defense let Grabow let her husband testify on her behalf. That's the ultimate, she was alive. That's the ultimate hearsay testimony. It's absurd. If you were legitimately trying to defend your witness, there's no way you would let that happen.
Not only that, but some of the interesting things that are brought up in that trial, really, I don't know how to describe it other than to say that they don't go anywhere. Like some of this stuff about the observation of the 802nd Division of Military Intelligence and the possible presence of sniper teams. Their contention there was to just simply introduce that idea, it seems, as opposed to sort of connecting them to the crime per se or to the wrongful death suit. And the amount of money, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think there was any large sum of money that was actually obtained by the King family.
For some reason I want to say, but I can't.
I want to say that I think it was like $1 that was actually given to them in restitution for it. This was supported by the King family, primarily by Coretta Scott King.
Correct.
Initially. And Dexter, but see, the children, in a way, take the mother's lead as far as addressing any of the stuff. And if you've ever dealt with any of them, you know this for certain, that they would not have spoken to anybody or participated in any of this stuff without their mother's sort of approval. So one way or another, Pepper ended up, I know that there's the idea that he was also friendly with King during the last year of his life and this kind of thing. But in addition, it's King's widow that sort of allowed Pepper to pursue this on their behalf.
Right. In fairness to Pepper, I don't think he did this as a charlatan or anything along those lines. But again, he's defending a guy in prison, James O'Ray, who's trying to get out of prison. The Jowers attorney, I hope the folks at home just think about this and Lloyd Jowers as a participant. Jowers is claiming he was offered the money by Carlos Marcello. There is some side evidence to suggest that Carlos Marcello was involved. I don't buy it, and I don't buy it for first off, Marcello was worth, I found a number of something like close to $50 million alone in 67. What kind of money would have to be involved to get him to kill King, especially?
Yeah, look, legitimately speaking, as far as, and I've taken some time to study quite a few of these organizations and some of the mob characters that are often brought up in various assassination plots, by the way. Marcello is the kind of guy who would not be involved in this at all unless there was some sort of very serious gain. He wasn't going to get his hands dirty with this kind of stuff.
And so take that issue, the serious gain. He was being prosecuted at that very time in 1968. And he gets convicted. Now, if the national security complex was involved, don't you think Carlos Marcello would have asked for some kind of quid pro quo?
Well, yeah, I mean, even Luciano got some sort of considerations. I mean,
Right. So, yeah, and yet that's what Jowers' story was. I mean, Jowers even laughed at the Raoul story because Pepper was accusing somebody actually named Raoul. And Jowers said, what kind of intelligence operative uses his real first name?
Yeah.
Hey guys, another question for you. What do you think would have happened if MLK had not been killed, if he had been able to live however long, he would have lived? What do you think his effect would have been on our world and the topics that he was strongly involved in? What do you think his effect would have been?
Oh my God!
But before you address that, Stu, I just want to say that if anybody else wants to join us, the telephone number to call in is 718-717-8296. And we'll be willing to try and field any of these questions that are relevant to the discussion. So go ahead, Stu, if you want to address what do you think would have happened basically if King had not been killed?
That's one of the great counterfactuals it could be asked. And King's my personal hero, and I like to think that he would have taken the country in an incredibly positive direction. But the unfortunate thing, as I was alluding to earlier, was he was touching nerves that the American public wasn't willing to really address in 68. I don't know. I mean, there's some reason to think that I've heard people who think that he even felt this way, that the FBI felt that he had lost enough support by 68 that they could, without getting asked questions about how did you find this out and why, drop all sorts of dirt on King that unfortunately they had been collecting on him for years. Right. I don't necessarily dispute that. You may have had a situation, unfortunately, where King would have been enmeshed in some kind of one of these sensational type of scandals.
See, and I think he would have. I'm in total agreement with you on that, Stu. Is that because I know that there's plenty of evidence in support of it, and I feel as though that they were definitely planning to take the fact that he had sort of marginalized himself at this point, and sort of take advantage of him when his numbers were down as far as his popularity went, and sort of spread some probably true things about him, and also some spurious things to sort of smear the guy out of existence. I think that was a very possible program.
And Jerry McKnight talks a lot about that too, that it looked as if it was increasing in 68, the willing, and again, because as you said, if he no longer has the friends King does in, say, the liberal media, they would be willing probably far more to promote stuff against him that they wouldn't have otherwise promoted. And again, I talked to somebody who had met with King the week before, and got every impression that King himself expected it to be there to be a major personal attack campaign against him, and expected it to take its toll. And in fact,
he did say in the end, he said in the end it won't be the words of your enemies, but the silence of your friends that you'll remember.
That's a great quote. Yes.
Very powerful quote. Powerful quote. Yeah.
Yes, I think that would have probably applied. What would have been interesting is what would have happened over time. As the country sort of softened. I mean, if you think about what happened to Muhammad Ali, he was, despised by a large segment of the country in the late 1960s. And he's regarded as a hero for what he did on the Vietnam War. You could imagine what the recovery would have been like for Martin Luther King if, he had hung around for a very long time. And I don't think he would have given up. I just think he might have been, demonized to the point where he might have lost his
credibility.
Yes.
Yeah, because the divisive issue of Vietnam at that time, which King was clearly addressing, not from a flag waving kind of standpoint at that particular point in history, it was a lot more dangerous for him to do that then, than it would be, say, today to even speak out against a war. I mean, that's often, I think, ignored by a lot of people that was really going to make him enemies in so many different camps that was just, I mean, there was no way that he was going to ever probably ascend again, without really reinventing himself to the sort of pinnacle of his power as a sort of public, figure that had influence over, so many people in so many factions, in this country at that time. I don't think that, I think that that's a seriously relevant thing if you consider the possible history from post 68. It would have, if he would have survived all of that, it may have even taken him a decade to sort of regain his strength, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think so. I think it would have.
Sorry, go.
Republican, right?
Who was that?
Martin
What was
Luther
that?
King was a Republican.
No, he was a Democratic supporter.
Yeah, I mean, he worked intimately with Democrats, but remember, Democrats of today are not the same as they were then.
Absolutely.
So, right. Prior to 1960, most black people were Republicans.
Well, many were, yes, because it was the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that took them from being, mostly in the cities. A number of African Americans leaned because of the New Deal in the Democratic way, but in the South, to the degree, and Midwest and other places, there were still large pockets of Republican African Americans. But now they're the largest voting group for Democrats post Civil Rights Act, post Voting Rights Act.
Right, and you got to consider that the Dixiecrats that existed, contemporaneous to that time period, were still in play. In a lot of ways. And not only that, the idea that a lot of African Americans at that time were Republican, some of that was even as far back based as the idea that who was it that, freed the slaves. You're looking at Lincoln being a Republican. That kind of loyalty right there was prevalent.
Lingering, absolutely.
Yeah, it was still lingering even up to that point 100 years later. So
absolutely. It only changed a bit in the New Deal.
Right.
So, I mean, with the civil rights, a lot of people believe that, the Democrats were the party of the KKK.
Absolutely.
So, What they did was, from just what we see today, what they do is they victimize the black people, and then they exploit them by grandstanding for them,
Well, I don't know how much politically I want to go in that direction.
Yeah,
but
that's kind of a little bit into a different direction from what we're covering here, but I can see where you're going with this. Look, I'm going to let you go right now because I want to get to a couple other points before my time runs out, which we've only got about, say, a little less than 20 minutes left. So I just want to make sure we cover a few more things with Stu here. But I really appreciate your call.
All right. Yeah, welcome to UCY. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, man. Okay, so where else? Let's see. We were discussing these other things. Sorry, I wanted to bring in the caller though, just to see what we were getting.
Absolutely.
And I think there was an interesting part of the discussion. But to go back to where we were, you've sort of given your ideas for why you had problems with the Raoul story and James Earl Ray in general. I mean, I'm sure the question that everybody is asking out there at this point is, in your opinion, after this study, what do you think James Earl Ray's role was most likely? To me, I think it's one of those things that's never going to be entirely understood now that the man is gone for certain, and now that so much evidence has been lost over time.
Right.
But what is your best estimate after looking at the case?
And first, I want to give the caveat at first that in the awful grace of God, we say the evidence doesn't allow any kind of certainty, in part because so much of it would depend on Ray being, verifying things.
Right.
General position is that Ray had very likely heard of bounty offers on King while he was in prison before he escaped in 1967, that he didn't leave with that when he escaped prison, with that being on the forefront of his mind. He went to Canada. He failed to get out of Canada get out of Canada out of North America to Europe then. And at some point, and we can't pin it down, we offer in Awful Grace possibilities as to when it could have happened. He then is turned on to this large money bounty that had been connected with white supremacist groups, and he went down to try and find it, had mixed success, was on the periphery, was probably known to people who were actively trying to kill King, and that the group on the ground, and this is sort of the part that sometimes gets lost, the group that we feel were the mechanics of the actual assassination were sort of hardcore criminals who were responding to the bounty offer. Somehow they reach out to Ray to be to basically stalk King and report on his movements. Somewhere along the line, and again, this is more mine than I would even say Larry's. I don't know if Larry's 100% on board on this. Somewhere along the lines, I feel Ray at the last minute, within a few days of the actual murder, decided, I don't want, the small amount of money for having cased him. I want the whole darn thing. And he doesn't have a real good solid plan as to how to do it. He doesn't have a really good solid plan how to kill King. And he's probably in Memphis to deliver the weapon to somebody who does. But then he turns around and does it himself, catching the people who were setting the whole thing up off guard.
Yeah, see, it's always been my impression that this whole thing just came off in a very haphazard manner, like if this was a well-planned conspiracy. And I think what you're saying is we're not looking at a lone gunman per se, but we are looking at probably a planned conspiracy that just didn't go off as planned.
Right. Well, one of the things, and again, this is where you get into highly speculative territory. The thing that was, our theory rests a lot on this subculture in the white supremacist movement that wants to foment a race war. And I even recently have come across documents from some people in these groups where they flat out say, we expect there to be a race war in 1968, and if it doesn't happen on our timetable, we're prepared to kill King and maybe other people to start it. And what I don't think they would have settled for just shooting him at at 6 o'clock at a hotel. some of the plots we explore were going to involve not just shooting him, killing other people in the process. There was one plot for 1965 where they were going to kill King in Ohio and then shoot the people as they ran away. One other plot, around the same time, they were going to blow up the entire Palladium Theater while King went to speak.
And these
they
plots...
were going for small stuff. I did a whole ebook called Rebels, Red Baiters, and Religious Radicals on the Birmingham bombing. The same group of people met the day before the Birmingham bombing that killed 4 little girls in September of 1963. And one of them tried to kill King when he came to Birmingham afterwards. He just couldn't get to him. Well, I spoke to somebody on the ground who was, there to mourn the girls, and he said, people don't understand. There were heavy machine guns in the streets. That killing created the second riot in the history of Birmingham. The first riot was May of 63, and that was just an attempt on Martin Luther King's life. So you could imagine they kill 4 little girls, create a riot, there are machine guns in the street. What would have happened had they shot Martin Luther King right afterwards? We're talking people who are looking for very serious events. I don't think shooting him on the second floor was necessarily in their plans. Could it have been? Could it have just been a crime of opportunity? Yes, I think that's possible. But my better bet, and this is more me than anybody else, was that they intended on killing King maybe right smack dab in the middle of his march. Maybe they shoot Coretta right alongside him, and you could imagine what would have happened if they had pulled that off.
That would have raised the ire of every single person there, and that would have just fanned out as reports spread.
Right, and it would have been, and the Klan guys, they weren't shooters. I mean, these criminal guys were professional hitmen who had been recruited to try and kill King in 64. And I sometimes wonder if that was meant for when King would come in 64 after the Mississippi burning killings. You could imagine again what would happen. But the Klan guys were all people who their main stuff was bombing and arson. So you could imagine what would have happened if, say, after King gets shot, things start exploding. Again, and this is all my speculation as to terms of what really went down, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that it went down that way.
Well, there was a lot of this stuff floating around. I mean, like I said, a lot of people don't realize that there were multiple bounties on King's head. There were bounties on all these guys that were involved in the civil rights movement. Any one of them that had a voice or a name in that movement pretty much had a price on their head in the South.
Right, and in King's case, it kept on going up. So in 58, J.B. Stoner, who happened to become one of James Earl Ray's attorneys, had something close to $2,000 bounty. By 65, J.B. Stoner's law partner, and probably with J.B. Stoner, had a $25,000 plot. And by 67, the White Knight bounty was up to $100,000. And we have a living witness who was offered it in prison.
Well, there's been multiple witnesses to that. I mean, there was just literally this stuff was all over the place.
Right. Well, I wouldn't say funny, but when they go in to try and verify and in fact do the story of Donald Nissen in 1967 that he had been offered $100,000 in Leavenworth prison by a member that we found, a guy who we later found out was a member of the Dixie Mafia, not to be confused with the Sicilian Mafia.
Right.
And they went back in 67 to talk with his cellmate, and his cellmate confirmed it. And his cellmate said, and you know what's crazy is right before I went into Leavenworth, I was hearing $100,000 bounties in bars in North Carolina. And it wouldn't have been hard to find it. We have another witness whose father saw $100,000 get offered in a bounty to criminals in Atlanta by businessmen.
Right. There were various bounties offered in the city of Atlanta. I know that.
Yes.
Yeah. There was a bunch of them. I mean, they ranged all over the place. I mean, that 100,000 was one of the better offers, but I mean, there was offers of $5,000 and $20,000 all over the place because they really wanted they wanted what they saw as sort of the rise of the of this counterculture to what they believed in, to be decapitated essentially, and that's what
Absolutely.
they're doing. Just before, we're running low on time, so I want to make sure that you mention, your books where they're available. You mentioned the ebook on the bombings, and I'd like you to just run that by us again, because I know you said it's available on Nook right now.
Yes.
And
it was on Kindle. I went through a third party and got taken down. Right now, if you go to Barnes if you go for Nook, and Kobo, there's a couple of others. You can find Rebels, Red Baiters, and Religious Radicals. It's only 40 pages. It's based on an article I published in September of this past year that got retweeted by Spike Lee. There's a lot of interesting stuff I got straight from the unredacted files from the FBI and the Birmingham Public Library. Again, it's called Rebels, Red Baiters, and Religious Radicals. It's on Nook. The regular book is called The Awful Grace of God. That's available right now on Amazon or any other online bookstore. Again, The Awful Grace of God. And then we actually have a book that's on, Larry and I co-wrote another book that just came out called Shadow Warfare, that's on the history of America's covert wars.
And just for my listeners, I got to tell you that Larry Hancock is an author that I've read for many years. So I'm actually looking forward to looking into that book, because the Shadow Warfare's concept is right up my alley for the kind of stuff that I've examined for years and years. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. But you have quite an interesting array of stuff here, and I've got to say that although I've only ever taken a kind of a cursory look at the King assassination, and have come to some interesting conclusions. I mean, the thing for me that is key here is that the official story, again, is never concise, never conclusive, and never correct. There's always more to this. And,
the thing that I'm almost as proud of as anything else, Jerry McKnight wrote the foreword to our book. He was very close friends with Harold Weisberg. He is a professor emeritus of history at Hood College. And for 10 years, he's taught a class on the King assassination. And he has used as one of his main texts, William Pepper's text. And we convinced him that our theory is the better theory.
And Gerald McKnight is the author of a really good book on the Warren Commission as well,
called Breach of Trust.
Breach of Trust, yes. Which again is one of my must reads as far as if anybody really wants to study the JFK case as well. But he teaches that class at Hood, and as you were saying, he's Professor Gerald McKnight actually. I didn't know that either, that he had sort of switched out Pepper's text for yours.
And Peter Dell Scott also said that he loved our book. So again, that to me, those are people who are at the height of the scholarship in political assassination research, and to sort of sway them in or get their vote of confidence, I think I was very proud to get their support.
Well, I hear you there. I mean, I'd be more than thrilled if my book got that kind of support. That's for sure. I've always appreciated your work anyway. I have always seen you as a presenter at some of these conferences. I think the first time I actually saw you do something was in 2003, which I think you were at WECT in 2003, right?
Yes, back when I was fighting the fight on the bullet lead analysis in the JFK assassination, and wound up getting vindicated in a big way a few years later.
Right. You had, oh, okay. Now I remember exactly what it was. Yes.
Yeah, I used to do battle with Professor Kenneth Ron.
Kenneth Ron, which, oh boy, I'm not even going to point you to that guy, but.
Yeah. Well, he disappeared, so I think we effectively discredited him.
And that was well done there because, and by the way, take a look at that because I know that Stu did some articles on that. And that is just an interesting study in how to evaluate physical evidence, from my point of view, how to evaluate the way that the bullet lead analysis had been conducted and the sort of, really a case study in the manipulation of, what should be very solid scientific evidence. And not manipulation on Stu's part here, but manipulation on other people's parts and how Stu added a great deal of clarity to that issue, for me anyway. So I definitely would point you in that direction as well. And I know that this was a very careful study on your part. And also, you know, the fact that that Larry Hancock's your co-author is, there's something to be said for that as well. Because Mr. Hancock has written a great many, interesting perspectives on the evidence in this case from more than one point of view. Well, in the JFK case anyway, but in the MLK case, I think that this is, really well thought out and I'm going to have to, take my time to study this book a bit because, it definitely sounds like you're answering a lot of the questions I've always had about this case because it never quite made sense to me that that the whole, like, it's not the same thing that happened in 63. It is connected only in that it occurred in the same time period. And it is, again, the official and the sort of mainstream cover-up of the case, in my opinion, may have been part of the same sort of mechanism that was utilized to sort of obfuscate the truth of history. But we are looking at two completely different guilty parties here, in my opinion, anyway.
Well, I mean, as one of the things that stands out to me is Lee Harvey Oswald is running into CIA surveillance left and right. He's somehow managing to associate with CIA people wherever he goes. And I'm not saying he's CIA, but you see the possibilities for the invisible hand a whole lot more there than, with James O'Ray. James O'Ray is running around dealing pot in Mexico City and trying to get into porn. I mean, it's not, there's not a parallel.
And it may be that there was an invisible hand at play here, but it's a completely different invisible hand.
Absolutely. I think it's a very different invisible hand.
Right. Well, I can't thank you enough for having been on tonight, and we're just about out of time. I'll probably hear my noisy outro coming up very, very soon. But, again, you've been listening to Stu Wexler, who is the co-author of The Awful Grace of God, and we've been discussing the Martin Luther King assassination, which occurred in 1968, only a day ago today. And I hope that this has been enlightening for me. I know that, and I hope that my listeners have learned a bit about the way these things function, and a little, just maybe even just a touch more about the real history of one of those major events that is often represented to us in one way, when meanwhile, if you attempt to dissect it for yourself, if you look into it for yourself, you'll find that there is always more to the story than those couple of paragraphs in high school books. Anyway, thanks again, Stu. Thanks for everybody who listened and everybody who responded to this show tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Thank you, Chuck.
Take care.
At the age of 19 in 1962, she was a...
But I have the files. I read this stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things. I said to myself, how can that be possible? Pistols and final slab of choice. I don't know what doesn't really matter. Internet, professional wrestlers, and not Jesse Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the cartoon comes from as long as it's real. It's hard to get real information because seriously.